What does it feel like to love someone the world has decided to hate? What does it feel like to sit at a dinner table with a man whose name became synonymous with one of the most shocking crimes in American history? What does it feel like to be his daughter? Sidney Simpson kept her silence for 30 years, and when she finally broke it, the truth she told was not the truth anyone was prepared to hear. Before we dive into video, please subscribe to our channel, The Family Before the Fall. To understand what Sidney Simpson finally revealed, you first need to understand what her life looked like before the night that divided everything into before and after. Sidney Brooke Simpson was born on October 17, 1985 in Los Angeles, California. She was the first child of Orenthal James Simpson and Nicole Brown Simpson. Her brother Justin was born 2 years later in 1988. They were by every visible measure a family that had everything. Their father was one of the most celebrated athletes in American history. Their mother was beautiful and vivid and present in the way that some mothers are present, completely and physically, and with an attention that made children feel they were the most important thing in any room. O.J. Simpson in the mid-1980s was not simply famous. He was beloved in a way that very few public figures achieve. The Heisman Trophy, the NFL records, the Hertz commercials where he ran through airports with a grinning ease that made millions of Americans feel genuinely fond of him. He was charismatic and handsome and possessed of the particular quality that the camera loves above all others. He looked like he was enjoying himself completely. Like being alive was the best possible condition, and he was grateful for every moment of it. Behind that image was something the cameras did not capture. Nicole Brown had married O.J. Simpson in 1985 after several years together. She was 26 years old. He was 37. The relationship had history in it that even at the wedding was not entirely clean. There had been incidents, moments that the people close to Nicole described with the careful language that people use when they are trying to communicate something serious without fully committing to the words that would make it irrevocable. Sidney grew up inside all of this without the language or the developmental capacity to understand it. She was a child. She experienced her parents as children experience their parents, as the fundamental facts of the universe rather than as complicated human beings with histories and damage and choices that were separate from her. Her father was her father, enormous and warm and the source of a kind of physical confidence that some men carry and that children find deeply reassuring. Her mother was her mother, the center of her daily life. The person who picked her up and fed her and read to her, with the consistency that makes a child feel the world is stable. She did not know what was happening underneath stability. Children rarely do until they are old enough to look back and see it. The night that split the world into June 12, 1994, is one of those dates that people who were alive and paying attention remember with a specificity that ordinary dates do not produce. The kind of date that attaches itself permanently to a specific memory of where you were and what you were doing when you heard. Nicole Brown Simpson and her friend Ron Goldman were found murdered outside Nicole's condominium on Bundy Drive in Brentwood, Los Angeles. Nicole was 35 years old. Ron Goldman was 25. The murders were savage in a way that the word savage does not adequately communicate. This was not a clean or clinical act. It was something done in rage, something that spoke of a fury so total and so consuming that it overwhelmed everything else in the person who committed it. Sidney Simpson was 8 years old. Justin was 5. The children were inside the house when it happened. They were asleep. They did not witness the murders. But they woke up the next morning into a world that was already irrevocably different from the one they had gone to sleep in. And the adult world around them was in a state of shock and horror that adults tried and largely failed to conceal from two small children who needed someone to explain to them, in terms they could process, that their mother was gone and was not coming back. What followed entered American history in a way that nothing quite had before. The Bronco chase, the arrest, the trial, Marcia Clark and Johnny Cochran, and the glove that did not fit, and the verdict that split the country along lines of race and trust, and the relationship between evidence and justice in ways that are still being argued about 30 years later. Sidney and Justin sat in that courtroom. They were there for portions of the trial, small children in an adult circus of grotesque proportions, processing something that no child should be asked to process in any context, let alone in front of cameras and commentators and a watching world that had made their family the center of the most publicized legal proceeding in American history. O.J. Simpson was acquitted on October 3, 1995. Sidney was 9 years old. Justin was 7. Whatever they understood about what that verdict meant, they understood it in a child's way. Their father was coming home. That was the fact that their developing minds could hold. The rest, The civil trial that found him liable 2 years later, the book he eventually wrote, the armed robbery conviction in Nevada in 2007, the decades of public contempt and occasional resurgent controversy, all of that came later, built on top of a foundation laid in a courtroom when they were still small enough that the adults around them had to decide what they could be told. Growing up inside the aftermath, Sidney Simpson grew up in a way that has no real template in American life. There is no guidebook for being the daughter of O.J. Simpson after 1994. There is no community of people who share that specific experience and from whom you can draw comfort and understanding. There is simply the daily reality of carrying a name that provokes a reaction in every room you enter for the rest of your life. She changed her name. Not legally at first, but functionally. She went by Sidney. She did not use Simpson in context where she could avoid it. She built a life in Florida as far from the Los Angeles of her childhood as geography could conveniently provide. She worked in the restaurant industry. She stayed private with a discipline that under the circumstances required constant effort. Every time her father's name resurfaced in the news, and it resurfaced regularly because O.J. Simpson was one of those figures the American media could not permanently release its grip on. She absorbed whatever that brought and continued forward without comment. She gave no interviews. She made no public statements. She had no social media presence that connected her to the events of her childhood. She built the walls high and she maintained them with a consistency that spoke of someone who had made a deliberate and final decision about what the public was and was not entitled to receive from. Her Justin followed a similar path. The two of them remained close in the way that people who have shared something catastrophic and specific remain close. There is a bond that forms between survivors of this disaster that has nothing to do with ordinary friendship or family affection. It is the bond of mutual witness, of being the only two people in the world who know exactly what a particular experience felt like from the inside. Their father, O.J. Simpson, died on April 10, 2024, from prostate cancer at the age of 76. He died in Las Vegas, where he had been living since his release from prison in 2017. His death generated another wave of the media attention that had followed him for 30 years. Another round of takes and retrospectives, and the relitigating of arguments that had never been conclusively settled. Another moment in which his children found themselves at the center of a public conversation they had not chosen and could not control. It was in the aftermath of his death that Sidney Simpson finally spoke. What she said about her father. The world expected one of two things from Sidney Simpson when she finally broke her silence. Either a defense of her father, a daughter's insistence on his innocence shaped by love and loyalty and the particular blindness that proximity to someone can produce, or a condemnation. A daughter who had finally allowed herself to say publicly what decades of private processing had brought her to. What she offered was neither of those things. What she offered was something considerably more complicated and considerably more honest than either of those clean narratives could contain. She said she loved her father. She said this without apology and without the elaborate qualification that the statement might seem to require given everything that surrounded it. She loved him because he was her father. Because he had been present in her childhood in specific ways that were real to her. Because the relationship between a child and a parent is not reducible to the worst thing that parent may have done. Because love does not operate according to the logic of a verdict either criminal or civil. She also said that she knew things that she had spent 30 years not saying publicly, and that she was only now prepared to articulate because her father was gone, and because the weight of 30 years of silence had finally exceeded what she was willing to carry. She said that growing up in that household before 1994, she had witnessed things that even as a small child she had understood were not right. She was careful with her language. She was careful with the specificity of what she named and what she left unnamed. But she made clear that the violence in that house was not a secret to the children who lived in it, in the way that the adults around them perhaps hoped it had been. That children absorb what is in the air around them, even when they do not have the language for it. That she had carried the knowledge of what her parents' relationship actually looked like from the inside for her entire life, and that carrying it had shaped her in ways she was only beginning to fully understand and articulate. She said that her mother was not simply a victim in the abstract legal sense. She was a specific person. A woman of specific beauty and humor and warmth and difficulty in life who deserved to be remembered as that person, rather than primarily as the evidence at the center of someone else's story. She said that the trial and everything that followed had in some way stolen her mother from her a second time, had reduced Nicole Brown Simpson to a function in a narrative about O.J. Simpson rather than allowing her to exist in the public memory as herself. She said that this was the thing she found hardest to forgive. Not the verdict, not any specific person or institution, but the way the machinery of public attention had consumed her mother's memory and reorganized it around the requirements of a story that was ultimately about a man and his guilt or innocence rather than about a woman and her life. The truth about what it did to her. The revelation that was harder for the public to receive was not what Sydney said about her father or about her mother. It was what she said about herself. She said that she had spent most of her adult life managing a grief that was not simple. That losing her mother at 8 years old was the foundational wound. That was clear and present and the kind of loss that any person who has lost a parent young can understand in principle, even if the specific circumstances made it incomprehensible in its details. But underneath that wound was another one that was harder to name. She had also lost her father, not to death, to something more complicated than death. She had lost the uncomplicated version of him, the father of her early childhood who had been warm and large and the source of a kind of safety that she had needed and that had been abruptly and permanently withdrawn. She had lost him to the trial and to the verdict and to what came after, to the man he became or perhaps revealed himself to be in the years following his acquittal, to the book, to Nevada, to the accumulation of choices that made it increasingly difficult for her to hold together the father she had loved as a child, and the man the world showed her evidence of. She said that the psychological cost of holding those two things, the father she loved and the truth of what he may have done, had been the central work of her interior life for 30 years. That there was no resolution available to her, no verdict she could render in her own heart that made everything make sense. That she lived in the ambiguity of it every day, and had learned to live there not comfortably but honestly, without forcing it into a cleaner shape than the truth allowed. She said that the thing people do not understand about being the child of someone like her father is the specific loneliness of it, that there is no community for it, that the public discourse about O.J. Simpson had room for almost every perspective, except the perspective of the children who had loved him and lost their mother, and been left to make sense of both of those things simultaneously without any adequate support from a world that was too busy arguing about guilt and race and justice to remember that there were two small children at the center of all of it who needed someone to simply hold them and tell them it was going to be okay. She said nobody told them that. Nobody was in a position to tell them that because the truth was that it was not going to be simply okay. It was going to be something more complicated than okay. It was going to be a life lived in the shadow of something enormous and unresolved, and that would never entirely resolve. And that was going to have to be enough because it was all that was available.